First, live, local. This is Fox 12 Now.
Hello and welcome to Fox 12 Now. I'm Greg Nibbler. Great to have everybody joining in wherever you are. You know, we're live streaming on our social media channels, our app, and our website. I always like to remind everybody that, so you have lots of options to be here for part of the show. Today, right now, starting off, we are talking about video games. Not just that, retro video games, really everything associated with video games. That's because the Portland Retro Gaming Expo is coming back, and we're going to discuss everything that goes on with that. To do so, I've got Toby Wickwire joining us right now, VP and Arcade Coordinator. Arcade Coordinator is such a cool title, so that's I'm really happy that we got to have that in there. But Toby, to start off, for everybody joining in, can you explain what the Retro Gaming Expo is?
It is a convention that celebrates the history of video games. So we have vendors buying and selling old video games, a giant section of old consoles to play, a big room full of arcade games and pinball machines, guest speakers, YouTube celebrities, and old programmers that made the games back in the 70s and 80s, 90s. The Tetris Championship. So all kinds of anything related to retro video games, basically.
Which there is a lot. I mean, if you think about going back all the way to the beginning with the video games, I mean, there's so many different options and things that you could be showcasing for this. And I want to emphasize too, this is huge. Like there is so much space. Can you talk about just the floor itself?
Yeah. So we added another hall at the Oregon Convention Center this year. So it's 150,000 square feet, I think. There's something for everyone there.
Yeah, seriously. And looking at this, like how many years have you been doing this now?
Since 2006.
Since 2006. So how much has that grown since 2006?
Yeah, 2006, it just started out as a very small event in a hotel event center in Vancouver with a few hundred people. And then, the last couple of shows we've had are between 10 and 20,000 people.
Few hundred to 10 to 20,000. Yeah, that's definitely. I mean, it also shows not only how great the expo is itself, but how much interest there is in retro gaming, in these video games, in all of that stuff. And can you talk a little bit about that? I'd love to know more about, what are the most popular things? Is it classic NES, classic systems? Is it going back to Atari? Like, what kinds of things are people showcasing there?
Yeah, so everything throughout the history. Back when the show started, I would say it was more focused on Atari and that era. And the games from the late 80s and early 90s were kind of just like old games. They weren't the big collectible. But of course, now, another 15, 20 years on, then those are also now the old timer games. So I would say that era, the 8, 16-bit era, is kind of the classic most popular, but there certainly are people that love the stuff before that and also after.
And this is a celebration not just of the video games themselves, so people can buy cartridges, buy whatever games it is that people might be selling, but it's also everything surrounding that and just how big it is, because you have costume contests, you have vendors selling artwork associated with video games, there's panels, and there's so many different things. I wonder if we could go into that a little bit, maybe even talking about some of the panels that you're going to be having. Yeah,
so we have, one of the more popular things is YouTubers. So that's something that didn't exist when we started the show, right. But now that's a big part of any collecting community, or even not even collecting, just being a fan of retro games, even if you don't buy them yourself, but is these YouTubers that do reviews and things like that. So one of our guests this year is the Angry Video Game Nerd, and he's definitely been one of the most popular video game YouTubers for years. So that kind of thing, as well as we also try to have the old programmers that made the games, even if sometimes they're not as popular as the YouTubers, we kind of want to still shine a light on them. So they're not forgotten, because they're getting to the age where some of them are starting to, not be around anymore. People that they were adults in the 70s and early 80s, and they're getting old, unfortunately.
But laid the groundwork for so much of what, that rapid expansion of video games in the 80s and early 90s. That's amazing, so having them there as well. Well, I want to talk to you about the arcade coordinator part of it, because part of what happens at the Retro Gaming Expo too is there's a bunch of video games you can go play, and there is an arcade there, and for you, so explain, I guess, what that role is for you.
So I'm sort of the in-between person between the board of the Retro Gaming Expo and the people that bring the arcade games, which are local arcades like Ground Control, Next Level. Those people have games they're bringing to the show, as well as local collectors. So I help coordinate with some people from Ground Control to get all of those games to the convention center.
And we got a couple of pictures there too, just showcasing some of it. So I got to ask, what are, year over year, what seems to be the most popular one?
Oh boy. I mean, a few people bring the newest pinball machines, and they're always popular because it's a chance to play them for free instead of, $1 or whatever you normally would have to pay at the bar. So that's always popular. Just sort of the most popular classics, I think, Pac-Man, Donkey Kong, Centipede, those things are just always, always, always jammed with people.
Well, for you, talking about your experience here, being here with the Retro Gaming Expo and video games in general, what's the era that's most, I guess, near and dear to you?
Well, I'm old, so the early stuff, Atari and television, ColecoVision, and then the arcade games from the 70s and early 80s. That's really the stuff that's nostalgic for me. But I do have an appreciation for the newer stuff as well.
Yeah, and so for some of that older stuff, I mean, that's going to be showcased there. Is that getting harder and harder to find, working consoles and equipment, or is there just a whole industry devoted to that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's as the years go by, it's getting harder and harder to find those things. When I started collecting video games in the 90s, that was what you could find at a thrift store easily. You could find Atari, NES, that stuff all the time. And now, not only is that stuff really valuable, but also you just don't find it really as much as you used to at any price. And like you said, it's deteriorating. So unless you either as a hobby like to repair these things or want to pay someone, like they're just not going to keep going by themselves. I mean, rare exceptions where something is really nice and hasn't been played very much, but most of the time they're kind of failing at this point. And one of the things that's nice is some companies are making new hardware to play these old games. So like, for instance, the Atari is coming out with a new console that you can play your old Atari cartridges on.
That's awesome. So
yeah.
So, going from, I guess, from that standpoint, from some of these older games, you also have the tournaments associated with a lot of the games, but specifically Tetris, the Tetris World Championship. And I've seen that there. It is intense. People are real serious about that sometimes. And I guess for everybody who's unfamiliar with that, can you talk about what the Tetris World Championship is?
Yeah, so it's the classic Tetris World Championship. So it's the NES version. Okay. And it started, quite a few years back. And what to me is really interesting in that is it started out as people that were, gamers in the 80s and 90s. They were the best. But now in the last few years, it's really young people that are the top of that in that tournament. They have different techniques. They can sort of like make the buttons vibrate, and it's insane what they're able to do. What's a game that is, now 30 something years old, that new ways to play it are being come up with in 2020 something is just crazy to me.
Still that popular, still huge, and younger and younger people playing it, which is really interesting. Yeah. And it's all played on the NES Classic. I know it's NES, and so when it comes to this tournament, as I mentioned, it gets pretty intense. I've seen it. How has that played out? How are the competitors during that? Have there been any extracurricular fights or anything that happens?
Not that I know of. I think they're usually pretty friendly with each other.
Okay. All right.
But it is very intense.
Right. Yeah, I mean, there's no rage quitting though in the middle of the Tetris World Championship. This whole event too, and I want to kind of give it a little bit of a context for anybody who hasn't gone there before. Like, if you walk in for the first time to the Retro Gaming Expo, what can you expect? What's that feeling going to be like?
Yeah, well, when you walk in the door, the first thing you're going to see in front of you is the arcade with all kinds of pinball machines and arcade games from the past, as well as you'll also see the vendor hall. So hundreds of vendors selling old video games and things related to video games, like you mentioned before, art, toys, anything related to video games.
And all there, and like I mentioned too, the costume contests, everything that goes on with that as well. And
Yes.
What is it about Portland that you think has made it such a good home for the Retro Gaming Expo for all these years?
Well, basically because we lived there to begin with. All the people involved in running the show lived in Portland, but most of us don't now. So it's a little more difficult to coordinate things. But I think Portland is special for an event like this. I think there's just something about the culture that allows something like this to flourish.
And you mentioned you work with a lot of local vendors. You brought up Next Level and Ground Control. So I imagine that's a big part of it as well. It's incorporating all of them in it over all these years.
Yeah, exactly. And on our board, we have the owners of 2 different local video game stores, Video Game Wizards and SideQuest Video Games. So that as well. So all of the local shops are vendors at the show. And then we try to include all the different barcades as well. As many as will work with us, basically.
Right. Well, I mean, there's plenty of people that are going to be there, so there's lots of opportunities, I would imagine. Okay. One more question for you. Do you have a favorite video game of all time?
Probably Tron Deadly Discs for Intellivision.
Wow. All right. That is not one that I expected. That's a pretty unique one right there. Awesome. Well, for everybody, I want to let everybody know how they can go, how they can participate, when it is, and all of that. Can you give us all the details?
Yeah, so the convention is October 13th through 15th at the Oregon Convention Center, and you can find all the information and tickets at retrogamingexpo.com.
Nice. And one quick other question, I wasn't expecting to ask this, but can you tell us what's in the background there of your shot? Because I'm fascinated by whatever's going on there.
This is my office. So one side has a bunch of Disneyland stuff, and the other side has some old sports memorabilia. Some baseball statues that are from the 60s that I got signed by the players in the 80s when I was a kid. There's Willie Mays, Don Drysdale, and Duke Snider there. And I don't know, my room and our whole house is full of collectibles. It's sort of my life.
You have a Mays and DiMaggio both sign those?
Not DiMaggio. Don Drysdale, Duke Snider, Willie Mays. Willie Mays is...
Willie Mays is up there.
Yes.
Okay, well, that's amazing. So I had to ask that. Well, thank you very much, for joining us to talk about this, and really looking forward to it. It is a lot of fun going down there, and I'm excited to see the arcade collection that'll be there. I'll be perusing that as well, and I'm sure a lot of other people will. So thanks for joining us here on Fox 12 Now.
Yeah, thank you.
And for everybody joining in, of course, we have more coverage coming up here on Fox 12 Now. So at 1:30, I'm going to be joined by Eric G. from Around the House Northwest. We're going to be getting a preview of this week's episode, but also we're going to be talking about smart home tech, and in particular, security tech. So different things you can do. You got the Ring cameras, but how can you take it up a notch? We're going to discuss that. Coming up at 2 p.m., I've got actress Siobhan Fallon Hogan who's going to be joining us. So plenty of things happening wherever you're watching. That's where you just go right back to. So we're going to sign off just right now. I'll be back at 1:30 p.m. if you're watching live. So jump right back on there. I will talk to you then. I'm Greg Nibbler. This is Fox 12 Now.